I knew something was wrong when I woke up to the sound of a plane landing in my cornfield. Not near it, not above it, not doing some friendly little buzz-by like the crop duster pilots do every few summers. No, this one was coming down with the confidence of a man parallel parking a rental car right into my livelihood. And when I stepped onto my porch, coffee steaming in my hand, bathrobe flapping in the breeze, I saw something even more unbelievable than the Cessna's spinning propeller. The HOA president hopping out like he owned the place. Now, mind you, I've lived on this farm since before half the subdivision even existed. Back when you could still see stars at night and the loudest sound after sundown was the crickets gossiping in the tall grass. But the HOA president, Jerry, a man who strutted like his clipboard was a sheriff's badge, was standing in my corn as if he'd simply popped over to borrow a cup of sugar. He didn't even look at me, just patted the side of the plane, adjusted his sunglasses, and shouted to someone behind him, "Runway extension looks good. Mark this section for clearing." My coffee nearly boiled over from sheer confusion. Let me back up for a moment and paint the picture of what life normally looked like on my side of the property line. Mornings were simple. The soft tick-tick-tick of sprinklers warming up, steam curling off the soil as the sun crested over the ridge, my cows bellowing their breakfast complaints as if I'd personally offended them by sleeping until 6:15. The smell of grass, hay, and brewing coffee in equal balance. My porch swing creaking rhythmically as I rocked gently back and forth, easing into the day like a man who had earned his peace. A retired Air Force veteran turned part-time district judge. Yeah, that part will matter later. I'd built a comfortable life. Not glamorous, not flashy, but mine. And my cornfield? That was home turf. If the farm had a heart, it beat somewhere under those rows. The neighborhood adjacent to my land was fine for the most part. A pleasant mix of retirees, young families, and that one guy who mowed his lawn shirtless year-round like he was immune to temperature. Over the years, I'd grown used to the sight of golden retrievers trotting along the fence line, kids chasing each other with water balloons, and neighbors waving as they passed by. Nothing complicated, nothing dramatic, until the new HOA board got elected. Suddenly, the subdivision took on a strange new energy, like someone had passed around a clipboard-shaped virus. Clipboards everywhere. Men and women walking around with measuring tapes, taking photos of mailboxes, arguing about shade variations in lawns. You know the type, well-meaning people who somehow get drunk off power that nobody should have. I started noticing them loitering near the boundary between my farm and their immaculate lawns, pointing at things with the seriousness of bomb technicians. At first, I figured they were planning a new fence or maybe a walking path. Then I overheard a comment, just a passing remark from a nosy neighbor while we both picked up our mail. "Shame your pasture just sits there," she said. "The HOA's been wondering if it could be used for something community-oriented." I laughed. She didn't. Still, I shrugged it off. Folks talk. The HOA talks louder. But the next clue came one afternoon when I walked the perimeter of the cornfield and saw the tire tracks. Not the usual ATV trails kids left when they snuck in to try impressing each other. No. These were heavier, wider, machine-grade. The kind you get from construction equipment. I bent down, touched the fresh grooves in the dirt, and exhaled sharply. "Teenagers," I muttered. "Probably joyriding on their dad's tractor." Wishful thinking. 2 mornings later, I heard machinery. And not the quiet, puttering kind. This was industrial. Metal on metal. Engine growl. The sort of noise that tells you someone is either building something or destroying it. Still in my slippers, I walked out to the far side of the cornfield and froze. A rented bulldozer. 2 men in reflective vests. A long, straight strip carved through the corn like someone had taken a razor to my livelihood. And standing there, clipboard in hand, sunglasses too shiny for the early hour, was Jerry, the HOA president, directing the chaos like a conductor at a very confused orchestra. I approached slowly, sipping my coffee because if I was going to hallucinate, I might as well enjoy the beverage. "Morning," I said, calm as ever. "Mind telling me what in the world you're doing?" Jerry didn't even turn around, just waved his hand dismissively. "No worries, sir. Just community improvements." "Community," I repeated. This is my farm. Yes, well, he said with a sigh. Our subdivision's Recreational Aviation Committee approved a runway enhancement. You weren't responsive to initial inquiries. I never received any inquiries. He checked his clipboard, flipping through pages like a man searching for a receipt he knew he didn't have. Well, that's not my department. I stared at him. He stared at the bulldozer. Neither of us blinked. My coffee went cold before the conversation did. Later that afternoon, I found something taped to the side of my barn. Neon yellow, printed with the confidence of a man who didn't think things through. An HOA violation, addressed to me, on my own land. The reason, interfering with community airfield expansion. I stood there in the fading sunlight, reading the paragraph twice just to confirm someone really had the audacity to put those words in that order. My cows watched me like they expected an explanation. This can't be real, I whispered, but it was. And it was only the beginning. That letter, ridiculous as it was, changed everything. It was the moment the calm, quiet life I'd built collided headfirst with the HOA's clipboard-fueled fantasy world. The moment irritation turned into strategy. The moment I realized peace wasn't coming back on its own. And as I stood there in the soft glow of sunset, neon notice fluttering like a warning flag, I understood one thing with perfect clarity. The HOA had picked a fight. A dumb one. A big one. And they had no idea who they were fighting. Because I don't just own the farm. I'm also the judge. And they were about to learn what illegally really means. I honestly believe that after the first letter, after our community improvements chat, after Jerry landed his little plane in my corn like it was the world's saddest airshow, the HOA would realize they'd overstepped. Maybe they'd apologize, offer to reseed the rows they chewed through, or at the very least leave me alone long enough to finish one cup of coffee without new nonsense appearing on my property. Instead, I got the next notice in under 48 hours. This time, they didn't tape it to my barn. Oh no, the HOA found a new level of boldness. They marched right up my driveway, past my private property sign, past the fence, past the cows giving them suspicious side eyes, and stuck the notice directly on my front door like they were serving a royal decree. It was printed on thicker paper too, fancy cardstock, the kind people use for wedding invitations. That alone told me I was in trouble. Nobody wastes premium stationery unless they're deeply committed to being ridiculous. The notice read, "Your property is in violation of HOA Airspace Ordinance 6B. Livestock have been observed obstructing authorized aviation pathways. Please relocate all animals within 72 hours. I blinked once, twice. My cows were obstructing aviation pathways. The cows. Big, slow, grass-eating creatures whose highest leap record was about 6 inches when startled. I looked over at them, chewing away, looking back at me with the emotional depth of wet sponges. They did not look like they were plotting an aerial blockade. Well, I told them, congratulations. You're criminals now. One of them burped. The notice wasn't even the worst part. Attached to the cardstock was a little laminated tag. Punched, hole-ringed, ready to dangle on a keychain. In bright red letters it read, "Temporary livestock restriction, airfield safety." I had to put my hand on the porch rail and steady myself because I genuinely, sincerely, could not tell whether this was real life or whether I'd fallen into a very boring Twilight Zone episode where the monsters weren't aliens but homeowners with clipboards. I marched down to the fence line where the subdivision's walking path ran behind my land. Sure enough, there they were. Jerry and 2 other HOA board members, standing in a clump, whispering like high schoolers planning a prank. Jerry held a binder thick enough to be a Bible, while another man took photos of my cows with the intensity of a wildlife journalist tracking a rare predator. "Can I help you?" I called out. Jerry jumped. He always had the nerves of a caffeinated squirrel, and pasted on a forced smile. "Oh, just documenting current conditions for the airfield compliance report," he said, flipping to a page that was mostly blank. "You're photographing cows." "Yes," he answered proudly, as if this confirmed their strategy. "They're impeding flight operations. They're chewing grass. That's part of the issue." I had no idea what that meant. None. But the thing about HOA board members is that they don't actually need their nonsense to make sense. They just need it written down somewhere in a binder with enough tabs and subtabs to look official. My neighbor, Linda, walked up at that exact moment. She was the unofficial neighborhood reporter, always carrying either a camera or a casserole. Today it was the camera. "Judge, blink twice if you're being harassed," she whispered like we were in a spy movie. I blinked twice just out of habit. "Oh dear," she muttered, turning her camera on the HOA board. Meanwhile, the HOA's treasurer, a lanky man with the personality of unsalted crackers, approached me holding a clipboard. "We have issued your second warning," he said, handing me yet another piece of paper, this time held in a protective sleeve like it was rare art. "You must remove all obstructions from our designated aviation corridor." "Your aviation corridor is my farm," I reminded him. "Yes, but according to our land use projection map." "You mean the crayon drawing I saw stuck to your cooler last week?" "It's a conceptual plan, right?" Down the path came another neighbor, Tim, a father of 3 who'd seen enough drama to last a lifetime. He slowed as he approached. "What's going on now?" he asked, rubbing his forehead. "The HOA says my cows are violating airspace," I said. Tim stopped, looked at the cows, looked at me, then said, "I'm not drunk enough for this conversation." I wish I could say that moment marked the end of the pettiness. But the HOA, when provoked, doesn't retreat, they escalate. That afternoon I got an email. Not a notice this time. An email, complete with HOA letterhead and a subject line so vague it felt threatening. Regarding compliance. The email politely informed me that the HOA had decided to tow my obstructive machinery to ensure passenger safety. I didn't understand what they meant until I walked out behind the barn and found one of my old tractors. Rusty, slow, beloved, being hooked up to a tow truck like a misbehaving teenager. The tow driver shrugged helplessly. "They said it was blocking a runway." "It's a cornfield," I said. He nodded sympathetically but kept hooking up the chains. That's when my dog started barking big, deep, angry barks, because even he knew this was wrong. My cows lined up like spectators, chewing loudly, clearly disappointed in humanity. "Hey!" I shouted. "Unhook it right now. That tractor stays." The tow driver hesitated. "Sir, they told me." "I don't care what they told you. This is private property." The shouting attracted even more neighbors. Soon there were 20 people standing around, phones out, drinking iced tea, whispering like they were watching a season finale. Someone even started taking bets. The HOA board, seeing the crowd, tried to look authoritative, but it's hard to look authoritative when you're arguing that a 1963 tractor is a threat to aviation. Finally, the tow driver gave up, muttered, "I'm not paid enough for this," and unhooked the tractor. The HOA was livid. You could practically see steam coming off their clipboards. And that's when the real humiliation moment happened. The HOA president, red-faced, sweaty, breathing heavily like he'd just run a marathon in a sauna, marched up to me and said, "Fine. If you refuse to comply, we will expand the runway regardless. Your agricultural interference will not stop this community's progress." I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, behind him, loud engine, roaring metal, another bulldozer rolled in, onto my land, straight toward another section of corn. And in that moment, with 50 neighbors watching, with dust flying, with the HOA grinning like they'd won something, with the bulldozer chewing into my soil like it owned the place, something inside me snapped. Not anger, not rage, something colder, calmer, heavier. A line in the sand. They'd pushed too far. They weren't stopping. Not unless someone stopped them. And as the engine growled and the earth shook beneath my feet, I realized exactly what needed to happen next. This wasn't just petty anymore. This was illegal. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea what judge really meant. They say everyone has a snapping point. Some people reach it when their neighbor parks too close to their mailbox. Others reach it when someone steals their Amazon package. For me, it arrived in the form of a bulldozer ripping a fresh scar through my cornfield while the HOA president stood there like he was conducting a military parade. And in that moment, Dust swirling, neighbors whispering, cows scattering. I realized something very simple and very important. I was done being polite. Not angry, not vengeful, just done. What the HOA didn't understand, and what most people never guess when they see me in jeans and boots instead of a robe, is that I make my living understanding rules. Their limits, their loopholes, the tiny gears that turn inside laws, regulations, policies, and ordinances. These people were playing checkers on a board I'd spent a lifetime building. So the next morning, instead of confronting them, yelling, or writing an angry letter, I made myself a quiet breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. Sat on my porch as the sun rose, letting the world settle around me like a well-worn jacket. Then I went inside, opened the drawer where I keep my official paperwork, and took out a small digital recorder, a camera, and a thick folder labeled Property Rights, Personal. It was time to start the quiet rebellion. First step, documentation. People underestimate that step. The HOA sure did. They thought the only paperwork that mattered was the kind printed on their letterhead, signed by their committee, and stuck on people's doors with passive-aggressive enthusiasm. But real documentation, the kind that stands up in legal settings, isn't printed in bulk. It's gathered, carefully. I walked the property line with the camera, narrating calmly. Unauthorized construction. Approximate damage, 32 yards of corn. Trespass marks. Machinery tracks entering from subdivision property. Additional pathway carved overnight. I zoomed in on everything. The torn soil, the displaced stones, the broken irrigation pipe. The cows followed me around like furry foremen, supervising my work with deep suspicion, as if they feared I might pin the whole ordeal on them again. I took photos from every angle, then measured the new runway extension with a tape measure older than half the people on the HOA board. I took soil samples. Overkill, sure, but I was letting my inner overachiever enjoy himself. Next, I pulled out the recorder and walked to the property fence just in time to intercept Jerry and his clipboard brigade. They were standing in a small cluster, going over what appeared to be laminated flight path diagrams. These diagrams, by the way, were so poorly drawn they looked like something a bored toddler would scribble during timeout. "Morning," I said with a level tone. Jerry turned, pursing his lips as though my existence inconvenienced him. "We hope you'll consider cooperating today. The community voted in favor of completing the runway. The community doesn't own this land. It is adjacent, and therefore subject to shared recreational easement. There is no such easement in my deed." Silence. A flicker of worry in their eyes. I continued, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the fence. "How about permits? Environmental impact assessments? Aviation safety permissions? County zoning approval?" Jerry blinked at each word like they were mosquito bites he didn't know how to scratch. Then, with the confidence of a man who has never read a single legal document he's waved at someone, he said, "We acted under a community mandate. Show it to me." He flipped through the clipboard, his fingers stuttering, shuffling pages the way a magician does when he's about to fake a card trick. But he found nothing, because nothing existed. I raised the recorder, clicked it on, and said, "Just confirming. You cannot provide any permits." Jerry froze. One of the board members paled. The other swallowed hard. "Let's not get dramatic," Jerry said. "Oh, believe me," I replied. "This is just documentation. Drama comes later." I left them there, stuttering in the breeze, and headed back to the house where my computer waited. I typed up my notes, uploaded every photo and video, cross-referenced property maps, and printed everything neatly. Then I called the county zoning office, not to complain, not to rant, but to ask for certified copies of the agricultural land use codes pertaining to unauthorized construction. The woman on the phone sounded baffled when I explained the situation. "They built a what now? A runway? Like an airplane runway? That's the type. And through your farm? Correct." Pause. A cough. Then, "Sir, that's the dumbest thing I've heard all year." "Don't worry," I assured her. "It gets even dumber." By lunchtime, I had a small mountain of evidence stacked neatly on my kitchen table. Every minute of trespass, every bulldozer path, every absurd claim documented and timestamped. I added copies of my deed, maps from records, and several long-standing zoning indicators. Then came step 2, filing the complaint. Land use violation, trespassing, illegal construction, improper machinery operation, destruction of agricultural property. Enough violations to wallpaper the HOA clubhouse. But I wasn't done. While they thought they were strong-arming a quiet farmer, they forgot the second half of my life. The half where I put on a robe and preside over land disputes far more complicated than their silly airfield. So I did something they would never expect. I scheduled a formal hearing. Not just any hearing. Their hearing. A date, a time, a docket number. Then I typed up a summons addressed to the HOA board members. Names spelled correctly, even though I was tempted otherwise, and prepared envelopes with official return addresses. I didn't deliver them myself. That would ruin the surprise. No, I let a county process server do it. There's a special kind of poetic joy in knowing the HOA, who loved serving notices like they were Halloween candy, finally got one themselves, from someone with the actual authority to give it. I heard the commotion before I saw it. Neighbors clustered on driveways, murmuring like bees around honey. Linda marched up the path with her camera, whispering, "Is it true? Did they get served? Oh, this is the best episode yet." Later, one of the board members approached me, pale and sweaty. "You called a hearing?" he asked. "Yes. For us. Yes. But you can't do that." "I absolutely can," I replied gently. "And I already did." Jerry arrived minutes later, looking like a man who'd swallowed a lemon whole. He waved the summons at me. "What is this? A summons? You can't summon us. You trespassed on a judge's property," I said. "You bet I can." Jerry looked around wildly, as if hoping someone would declare it all a prank. No one did. Even the cows seemed to be staring at him with judgmental disappointment. "You won't win," he muttered finally. "The community is behind us." "Wonderful," I said. "They can watch the hearing." And just when I thought the day couldn't get better, the process server returned, holding an extra envelope. "This one's for you," he said to me. "Certified." I opened it on the spot. My eyebrows rose. The HOA had doubled down, filing a complaint against me for obstructing community flight progress. They really wanted a fight. Good. Because now they were getting one. Quietly, legally, perfectly within the bounds of every rule they thought they understood. And as I stood there with my summons in one hand and their pitiful complaint in the other, I felt something settle over me. Calm, cold, steady. They had no idea what was coming. None at all. The week leading up to the hearing felt like living inside a slow-boiling pot of gossip soup. You'd think a farm and a quiet subdivision would keep to themselves. But no, word travels faster than free donuts in a break room. Every day, more neighbors gathered at the fence line, lawn chairs in hand, ready to witness whatever the HOA would do next. Some brought binoculars. Others brought lemonade. One woman brought popcorn like she was tailgating a football game. By Monday morning, the HOA was spiraling. They held 3 emergency airfield safety meetings in 2 days, which was impressive considering they'd never held more than 1 meeting a month before. Apparently, panic breeds productivity. I watched them from my porch, sipping my coffee, listening to the faint hum of anxiety drifting across the property line. I didn't interfere. I didn't speak to them. I didn't need to. They knew the hearing was coming, and they knew, deep down, they'd stepped in something far bigger than a patch of corn. The first meltdown happened during a subdivision-wide newsletter email blast titled Clarification on Community Aviation Developments. It was 2,000 words of pure nonsense, flowery language about enhancing communal identity, embracing innovation, and expanding recreational horizons, concluded with a sentence so bold I had to reread it. The Runway project was approved by partial consensus of the Recreational Aviation Committee. Partial consensus, meaning Jerry and 2 friends said, "Why not?" The neighbors were not impressed. One by one, people forwarded me the email with comments ranging from, "Is this a joke?" to They're definitely drinking the HOA punch again. 2. My husband wants to use the runway to park his fishing boat. Then came the second meltdown. They posted laminated signs along the walking trail declaring the area a temporary airspace preservation zone. These signs had pictures of airplanes printed on them, clip art airplanes at that, and fine amounts written in Sharpie. $500 for lawn encroachment. $754 unauthorized wildlife presence. $1,000 for tractor interference. Wildlife, meaning my cows. Neighbors started taking selfies next to the signs. One guy saluted in front of the airspace zone sign like it was a military monument. Another neighbor hung a tiny American flag on it, which somehow made it even funnier. Meanwhile, the HOA huddled at the far end of the path, whispering fiercely and flipping through their binders like they were trying to cast a spell. The third meltdown came when they called the police. I was repairing a fence post that afternoon when 2 officers pulled into my driveway. They didn't get out at first. They just stared at the runway carved through my field, then exchanged looks that said, "We need hazard pay for this." When they finally approached, they seemed embarrassed. "Sir," the taller one said, "we received a call about an aviation safety hazard." I glanced around. Peaceful farm. Quiet cows. 0 airplanes. "From who?" I asked. "The HOA president." I pointed to the corn. "What part of this looks like an airport?" The officer rubbed his forehead. "Honestly, none of it. But we have to check." I walked them to the edge of the runway, explained the situation, and watched their expressions evolve from confusion to disbelief to weary amusement. The shorter officer sighed. "This is the pettiest call we've had all month." "Actually," the taller one corrected him, "it might be all year." When they left, the HOA looked furious, like the police had betrayed them by not storming my property and arresting my corn. But the true chaos didn't begin until the evening before the hearing. The HOA called a special session of critical importance, which, based on the turnout, was apparently the social event of the season. I strolled by just close enough to overhear as neighbors filled folding chairs, passing around lemonade jugs, fans, and, God help them, snacks. The HOA president took the stage, or rather, stood behind a flimsy card table draped with an American flag beach towel. He cleared his throat dramatically. "We are under attack," he began. Immediately, 3 people checked their phones for emergency alerts. "Not physically," he clarified. "Legally." The dramatic tension fizzled. Someone coughed. Jerry continued, "A certain landowner, who shall remain unnamed, has weaponized the legal system against community progress." There were snorts. Someone muttered, "Say his name, Jerry," which made the crowd giggle. Jerry pressed on. "We must stand strong as a united front. The runway will be completed." The neighbors didn't cheer. Instead, they started asking questions. "Where are the permits? Who approved this? Why are there airplanes on the signs? Why didn't we vote? Can I land my drone on it? Is this about the cows?" The HOA board fumbled through answers that had the structural integrity of wet cardboard. Then came the final straw. The treasurer stepped forward with a poster board titled, "Official Master Plan." It was a crude sketch of the subdivision with an enormous runway drawn straight through my farm, and through the neighbor's house, and partially through the community pool. The audience collectively lost it. Laughter erupted like a geyser. Even Linda recorded the whole thing, adding commentary like, "This is better than television." The HOA board panicked, insisting the sketch was conceptual and not to scale. The meeting dissolved into arguments, finger-pointing, and someone asking whether the runway would interfere with backyard barbecues. That's when I decided to approach. Chaos dulled to a hush as I walked up to the card table and placed a single, neatly folded paper on it. A cease and desist letter. Jerry picked it up, his hands trembling, his face drained of color. One board member whispered, "Oh no." Another whispered, "We're doomed." And that was the moment, the perfect moment, when I delivered the one thing this story required. The call to action. "At this point, I've got to ask," I said, my voice calm. "Have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, Hit subscribe if you love poetic justice. And let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. The crowd actually laughed. The HOA did not. Then, with timing I couldn't have planned better, the process server walked into the meeting and handed each board member an official hearing reminder. Panic. Pure, wonderful panic. Jerry squeaked, an actual squeak. The treasurer dropped his poster board. The secretary grabbed her binder like a life raft. The meeting devolved into pure meltdown. Neighbors argued. Kids ran around pretending to be airplanes. Someone yelled, "My property taxes aren't paying for this nonsense." I stepped back and watched it all unfold like a man watching karma do deep tissue massage. And then, just when it seemed it couldn't get any more ridiculous, Jerry shouted, "We will fight this in court. We will present our case with dignity and unity." Sure, unity lasted exactly 14 seconds before two board members started blaming each other for approving the bulldozer rental. People left shaking their heads, muttering about lunacy. Even the HOA loyalists looked shaken. As the meeting broke down into chaos and folding chairs scraped angrily against the pavement, I walked home slowly, feeling the warm satisfaction of a quiet plan unfolding exactly as intended. Because tomorrow was the hearing, and they had no idea what awaited them. None at all. The morning of the hearing dawned with a strange, electric quiet, the kind you get before a thunderstorm rolls in. Except this time, the storm wasn't in the clouds. It was wearing clip-on ties, clinging to binders, and sweating through cheap polyester. I woke up early, brewed a stronger-than-usual pot of coffee, and watched sunlight creep across the field where their so-called runway lay carved like a scar across my land. It was almost beautiful in its stupidity. I dressed in my usual trousers and shirt, nothing noticeable. Then, with the slow deliberateness of someone about to unlock a new level of chaos, I lifted my judge's robe off its hanger and laid it across the passenger seat of my truck. I didn't put it on yet. That moment needed to be timed like a movie entrance. When I pulled up to the courthouse, the HOA board was already there. Jerry stood front and center, pacing like an anxious rooster guarding his flock of equally panicked hens. He had a thick binder tucked under his arm, probably stuffed with made-up rules, outdated versions of bylaws, and those ridiculous clip-art runways. He didn't notice me at first. His treasurer did, though. The man's eyes widened in a way usually reserved for spotting wild bears. "Jerry," he whispered urgently, tapping the president's shoulder. "Jerry, he's here." Jerry turned, puffed out his chest, and attempted a smile. It looked less confident and more like someone trying to hide a toothache. "So," he said, walking up to me with the swagger of a chihuahua trying to intimidate a Great Dane. "Ready to settle this reasonably?" "Always." I nodded. He took this as a sign of weakness. Poor man. "Well," he continued, "our documentation is airtight. We've got maps, signatures, and the community's vision on our side." I raised an eyebrow. "Signatures? From who?" He cleared his throat. "Members of the Recreational Aviation Committee." "You mean you, your treasurer, and your cousin who lives 2 streets over?" "It's a quorum," he snapped, "of 3 people. Still counts." This was going to be delicious. Inside the courthouse lobby, neighbors had already gathered on benches, whispering excitedly. Linda was there with her camera, of course. She didn't record inside the courtroom, but that didn't stop her from narrating every detail to the people around her like a sports commentator. I walked down the hallway to the courtroom door. The HOA followed behind, their footsteps uneven and jittery. And then came the moment. I stepped into the judge's chambers, closed the door behind me, and slipped on the robe. People underestimate how symbolic clothing can be. That robe was a quiet storm cloud settling over my shoulders. When I emerged, the bailiff announced my presence. "All rise." Jerry rose halfway, then froze, eyes widening, mouth dropping open, binder slipping from his hand and thudding onto the floor. The treasurer slowly sat back down, then stood up again, then sat down again like his internal software was glitching. The HOA secretary let out a noise that sounded like a tea kettle beginning to boil. I walked to the bench, calm, steady, composed. The sound of air thickened. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim a little, as if they, too, understood the gravity of this moment. Court is now in session, I said. Before we begin, let's confirm the parties present. Jerry's voice cracked like a teenager at choir practice. Your Honor. Yes, Mr. Jensen? You're the judge? I am, I replied, folding my hands. And I trust there will be no concerns about impartiality. After all, I would have recused myself if there were any legal grounds requiring it. There were none. They had trespassed on my land, not appealed under my court's jurisdiction. I was fully within my authority. Jerry let out a tiny squeak. The secretary fanned herself with her folder. The treasurer whispered, "We're dead," under his breath. "Let's begin," I said, opening the file before me. "We're reviewing multiple alleged violations by the Evergreen Hills Homeowners Association, including unlawful trespass, unauthorized construction, property damage, and misuse of community funds." Jerry slowly raised his hand. "We would like to counterclaim that you obstructed aviation development." I nodded. "Your counterclaim is noted. Please present your evidence." He approached the bench, handing me the infamous master plan sketch, the one drawn in thick black marker that cut through my land, through the neighbor's yard, and straight through the community pool. I looked at it, then at him, then back at it. "This," I said slowly, "is your evidence? It's conceptual. It's a drawing," I replied. "With vision," he insisted. "It looks like a 5-year-old planned an airport with a crayon." Behind him, several neighbors snorted loudly. "Do you have any permits?" I asked. "No," he whispered. "Environmental approval?" "No." "Easement agreements?" Silence. The treasurer shuffled forward. "We considered filing them." "Considered," I said. He nodded weakly. "Yes, conceptually." I turned to the secretary. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation supporting your runway project?" She held up a binder proudly. "And what's in that binder?" I asked. "Our bylaws." "Your bylaws," I repeated, "which govern your community and your community alone. Nowhere extending onto privately owned agricultural land." Her smile dimmed like someone had unplugged her confidence. I spent the next hour going through every piece of real evidence the HOA had failed to consider. Photographs of the bulldozer tracks, the torn irrigation system, land registry maps with hard boundaries, video recordings of Jerry confidently declaring community ownership of my soil, receipts for the bulldozer rental paid with HOA funds. When I finished, the courtroom was quiet enough to hear dust settle. "Mr. Jensen," I said to the HOA president, "you conducted unauthorized construction on privately owned land. You trespassed. You permitted machinery to cause property damage. You issued baseless violations. And you attempted to expand community assets onto land that is not and never has been yours. What do you have to say for yourself?" He swallowed hard, twice, then said the only thing he could think of. "It was conceptual." The courtroom erupted. Neighbors laughing, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads with second-hand embarrassment. I raised my hand and the room fell quiet again. "The ruling is as follows," I said, voice clear, each word landing like a hammer on a nail. "The HOA is liable for all damages. They will immediately cease all construction, restore the land to its prior condition, repair the irrigation system, and compensate the landowner for crop loss. Additionally, the HOA board members will complete mandatory property rights training to ensure they do not repeat this behavior." Jerry sagged like someone had deflated him. "And one more thing," I added. "Misuse of HOA funds is a serious breach of fiduciary duty. Your actions will require review by the subdivision's membership." That was the moment he broke. Right there, in open court, Jerry, the man who had strutted onto my farm declaring himself the guardian of community progress, removed himself as HOA president. "I resign," he whispered. His treasurer sighed like a man freed from an oppressive regime. His secretary muttered, "Thank goodness." The neighbors clapped, actually clapped. After closing the session, I walked outside, took a deep breath, and looked at my cornfield. Workers would be out soon to restore the land, and the runway, if you could call that sad strip of dirt a runway, would be gone. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tension drain out of my shoulders, replaced with something warm and effortless. Vindication. I walked the fence line that evening. The sky was painted in golds and purples. The cows grazed quietly, finally free from their aviation criminal charges. My dog wagged his tail as if congratulating me personally. When I reached the far edge of the field, I spotted something taped to my fence. Not a violation, a reimbursement check from the HOA, signed, ironically, by the very man who resigned hours earlier. I laughed, a quiet, satisfied laugh that drifted across the field like a well-earned breeze. The war was over, but as I turned to head home, I felt a shift in the wind. Something told me the aftermath was going to be just as interesting, because HOA drama doesn't go away. It evolves, and mine had one chapter left to tell. The strange thing about peace is that when it finally arrives, after weeks of chaos, arguments, bulldozers, and binders, it feels almost suspicious, like the world's playing a prank, letting things quiet down just long enough for you to breathe before it throws the next curveball. And for the first few mornings after the hearing, that's exactly how it felt. I'd wake up expecting the sound of machinery, or the flutter of another bright HOA notice taped somewhere inappropriate, or Jerry's shrill voice drifting across the field like a mosquito with a megaphone. But instead, nothing. Just the soft rustle of wind across my pasture, the gentle grunts of my cows stretching awake, and the sun pouring gold across the soil. It was the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heartbeat. The restoration crew arrived 2 days after the court ruling. A group of young workers who looked like they'd been briefed on the situation and found it hilarious. They shook my hand, promised to fix every inch of damage, and immediately got to work pulling up runway markers and smoothing out the scars carved into the earth. One of them, a kid barely old enough to rent a car, stood in the middle of the mangled runway and said, "Man, who thought this was a good idea?" "An HOA," I said. He blinked. "Say no more." Over the next few days, they patched the soil, replanted rows, repaired the irrigation pipe, and made sure everything looked the way it had before Jerry decided to take community development into his own extremely misguided hands. There was something oddly sentimental about watching the field heal, like watching a wound close, sunlight by sunlight, shovel by shovel. The neighbors, for their part, stayed fascinated. It seemed every time I glanced toward the fence line, there was someone watching or whispering or marveling at the sheer absurdity of it all. Even kids came out, leaning against their bikes, pointing at the disappearing runway, like they were watching a historical site being restored. By the third day, the rumor mill was running at maximum speed. I heard Jerry tried to claim the cows attacked him. I heard he blamed the bulldozer rental on a clerical error. I heard the Recreational Aviation Committee was just him and his cousin playing Microsoft Flight Simulator. Honestly, the truth wasn't far from that last one. But the biggest change wasn't the field or the gossip. It was the HOA itself. Without Jerry at the helm, the board looked like a ship that had just lost its most dramatic, least competent captain. The treasurer, now acting president, carried himself with the exhausted peace of a man finally freed from babysitting a tornado. The secretary walked slower, breathed deeper, and didn't hold her binder like a shield anymore. And the members? They seemed almost relieved, like they'd been stuck inside a sitcom plot they never asked to be part of. A few days after the hearing, the treasurer knocked on my door. He was holding a neatly organized binder labeled, "Corrected Community Guidelines." He began, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just wanted to apologize. Officially. Personally. We kind of lost control there for a bit." "A bit," I repeated. He winced. "A lot. A whole lot. Too much." We shared a long, quiet moment that ended with him handing me a piece of paper. Not a complaint, not a fine, but a handwritten apology letter. It wasn't long, but it was sincere. And sincerity goes a long way in a world where people weaponize rules to settle personal grievances. After he left, I pinned the letter on my fridge. Not out of triumph, out of hope, because sometimes people really do learn. And sometimes they just need a reminder they aren't invincible, not even with a clipboard. Over the next week, life slowly drifted back into its old rhythms. I walked the field each morning, checking the new sprouts. My dog trailed behind me, nose buried in the ground, hunting for scents only he could identify. The cows grazed peacefully, blissfully unaware that they had once been labeled aviation hazards. Felt good. Felt normal. But normal never lasts in a neighborhood with an HOA. About a week after the restoration wrapped up, I received a knock at the door. It was Linda holding a Tupperware packed with lemon bars. "Thought you could use a treat," she said. "You earned something sweet after dealing with that circus." I thanked her, took the container, and leaned against the porch railing as she filled me in on the latest developments. "Did you hear?" she whispered, voice full of delighted mischief. "They fined Robert on Maple Court." "For what now?" I asked. "His pink flamingos." "Pink flamingos?" She nodded gravely. "Apparently, they're disrupting the visual harmony of the streetscape, or whatever nonsense phrase they copy-pasted." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "And this is after the whole Runway fiasco?" "Some people never learn," she said with a shrug. Later that afternoon, I walked to the fence line and saw the flamingos myself. Two bright plastic birds cheerfully standing in a neat flower bed. The HOA violation notice was stuck to Robert's mailbox like a scarlet letter of suburban shame. He spotted me watching and called out, "If they think they're getting rid of my flamingos, they're going to have to pry them out of my cold, decorative lawn." I gave him a thumbs up. The thing is, HOA drama is like seasons. It cycles. It fades. Then it comes back in a new color with slightly different packaging, usually involving yard decor or paint swatches. But my perspective had changed. Where before I saw it as a nuisance, now I saw it as something almost predictable. Understandable, even. People crave control, certainty, structure, even when they grasp for it in the wrong places. And usually, when people act out of petty power, it's because they're wrestling with something bigger inside themselves. Doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. A few evenings later, as I walked the field under a sky painted in soft blues and purples, I thought about everything that had happened. The bulldozer, the nonsense violations, the meeting meltdowns, the courtroom showdown. All of it ridiculous. All of it exhausting. All of it, in a strange way, profoundly human. When I reached the far edge of the field, a breeze rustled the leaves. I closed my eyes and let the peace settle into me. Not just the quiet of the land, but the quiet of resolution. Because in the end, justice isn't loud. It's steady. It's patient. Comes in the form of truth calmly stated. Boundaries firmly drawn. And sometimes it comes wearing a robe. I walked back toward the house, my dog trotting beside me, the smell of fresh soil rising from the ground where the runway once stretched like an open wound. I felt lighter, grounded, ready for whatever petty squabble the neighborhood might cook up next. And as I stepped onto the porch, I thought of the one lesson the whole ordeal had taught me. Something worth carrying forward. You can't control the petty, but you can always outsmart it. Always.